Hi everyone. This week we will be discussing culture. And the reason why this discussion is important is that in week 2 we had talked about mosaic versus melting pot. And as I had noted in some of the comments, the mosaic approach is the foundation and the reason why we practice multicultural marketing. And so, what we'll be kind of discussing is the why and the how different groups are different. So, first and foremost, we begin with a definition of culture. And in your reading of Nuella chapter 3, which is your assigned reading for this week, you will see several definitions of culture. When I was growing up, one of the most basic definitions that I was taught was that culture was the way of life of a people. One of my favorite definitions is from Geert Hofstede, which is not mentioned in the book, but Mueller does talk about his work a little bit later in the chapter. And it basically says that culture is the collective programming of the mind. And what that means is that culture is normally shared. It is taught, so you are not born with a culture. You are taught your culture in your communities, in your groups. So in the family, in school, in church, or whatever religious setting that you grew up in, all of these things contribute to the cultural identity of an individual. And so that's one of the first things that Mueller talks about. And one of my favorite authors in multicultural marketing is Dr. Felipe Corseni, and he says pretty much that all marketing is cultural because all marketing is conducted from the perspective of somebody. They are telling the story, assuming certain values, assuming that persons will respond in a particular way. And so whether the advertising message is developed from the perspective of the dominant culture or mainstream culture, or it is developed from the perspective of a co-culture or a minority culture, it is normally cultural because it assumes certain cultural values. It assumes people feel a certain way, think a certain way, and will respond a certain way to the advertising message. So in our discussion of culture, we and the text talks about the difference in perspective between noting minority cultures or as subcultures as opposed to co-cultures. And we use the word co-culture because we want to express in our definition that these cultures are equally important and valued, and the culture is not necessarily less than or subservient to the mainstream culture. And that is just another way of in perspective, acknowledging the importance and the role that those cultures play in people's lives. And when we think of co-cultures, we're not just thinking about minority groups in terms of ethnicities, but we are also thinking of religious beliefs. We're thinking of political beliefs. We're thinking of heritage, for example, Irish, Americans, Greeks, Italians, who they do observe a lot of the rituals, and they maintain their cultural identity, and they actively do that in their communities. So when we think of co-cultures, we're also thinking of the LGBTQ community. We think of millennials, baby boomers, generational groups who they have some similarities and common beliefs that make them a co-culture. We one of the things that we try to acknowledge as we engage in multicultural marketing, we engage in multicultural research, and we try to understand different cultural groups and try to tell these stories of these cultural groups, is to understand that we normally see people and other groups through an ethnocentric lens. We tell their stories from our own perspective. And this is what we talk about Mueller talks about in the text in terms of the self-reference criterion. We have to acknowledge that we have a skewed perception of everything that goes on and how we see other groups and their values and their rituals. And we have to be careful to avoid ethnocentric beliefs And we have to shed that, because when we think of other cultures and we see their practices and their rituals and we see them as strange, that's an ethnocentric thought. We should see them as different, because we are taught in all cultures what is normal, what is abnormal, what is the right way to do things, what is not the right way to do things. So when you see persons from another culture engaging in an activity, you might say they're doing it wrong, or they have a weird way of doing things, when really this is just based on their cultures, their rituals, their norms. And so that is something that we try to acknowledge first as marketers, and then as much as possible try to set that aside when we begin to try to form an understanding of different cultural groups. One of the concepts that I want you guys to be very, very clear on the distinction between the two, and Muella talks about it, is the difference between assimilation and acculturation. When we talk about assimilation, we talk about persons moving into a particular cultural space, meaning a different country, and they begin to adopt the values of that other country, the culture of that other country that they're in, or that other group, and they basically set aside their original cultural beliefs. Now, as Muella talks about in her work, that is normally from the majority perspective. People assimilate, meaning this is from the dominant culture's perspective. They perceive people as assimilating or adopting their culture, becoming like them. But from the minority perspective, and what really truly does happen, is that there is acculturation, which means persons begin to adapt to the environment around them. They may change certain behaviors and attitudes and begin to consume, for example, the food that is available, the media that is available, but that doesn't mean that their values, which are at the core of the individual, have changed. And Muella talks about this, the cultural values are very, very strong and abiding. They last over generations, and not just because somebody speaks English, or not just because they wear the same clothes that you do, that doesn't mean that their cultural identity, their values have changed. So in acculturation, we see where there is a taking on of certain aspects of the culture. There is a modification of behavior, right? And so this is when people become bicultural to some extent. And acculturation occurs on a continuum, which means it can be a little or it can be a lot. And over time, you will find that more and more changes occur. But one of the things that we want to bear in mind is that when we talk about acculturation, the home country culture of the immigrant does not disappear or dissipate. They accept certain norms, and they may adopt some of the behaviors that they see around them based on the culture that they're in, but their deep abiding cultural values and cultural identity have not changed. And that is something that we take into consideration in multicultural marketing. So we have talked about culture, and Muella transitions into talking about how culture affects communication. And one of the basic things that we look at is language and culture. In many instances, the use of language is indicative of membership of a particular culture, and language is so culturally bound that you almost can't separate them from each other, right? In certain cultures, language is very, very prominent. So when we talk about high and low context cultures, in low context culture, what you say has a lot to do with the message communicated, whereas in high context cultures, a lot of the communication is situational and nonverbal. And so one of the things that we identify and we acknowledge going forward is how important language is to communication. When we talk about language use, in many instances, when we talk about acculturation, the use of language is normally considered a marker of acculturation. So persons who may be from a country that speaks another language, when they come into the U.S. culture, their adoption of the English language, or their preference for communication in English is normally indication that they have acculturated more than somebody who would prefer to receive all their communications in their home country culture. So, for example, in the Hispanic household, whereas in first generation Hispanics, meaning the persons who migrated from that country, you might find that the level of acculturation is a little bit lower. They prefer their communications in Spanish. They may prefer their communications in Spanish. As you go up the generational ladder, you might find that the persons are more bilingual, so they speak both languages comfortably, or to a lesser extent, they are English dominant, but that does not mean that they don't identify with the Hispanic culture and they don't consume media in Spanish language, or they don't consume advertising in Spanish language, okay? It's the same thing with Asian Americans. One of the things that we want to acknowledge for Asian Americans is that Asian Americans is it's a very diverse group. So Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Thai, these are all different people who, to some extent, you have different languages that you're dealing with, different cultural values that you're dealing with, different family structures that you're dealing with. And so when we look at even the Asian American group, we have to contemplate and consider that these groups differ depending on country of origin. It's the same thing for Hispanics. You have Caribbean Hispanics as opposed to Latin American Hispanics, Central American Hispanics, and even the Spanish spoken is different. Even Brazilians are considered Hispanics, but their language is Portuguese. And so we don't necessarily see these groups as homogeneous, meaning they are all the same. While they may have similar cultural values, on the language scale, you might find that these people may speak completely different languages. And so advertising that's developed for a Mexican American may not resonate with a Cuban American. And in many cases, these people consider themselves to be completely different from each other. In terms of verbal communication, we've talked about language, but one of the things that we will talk about here is, for example, African Americans. In many instances, people see African Americans as American, and so and because they don't require a different language, that's normally an excuse for the advertising budget or the marketing communication that is directed towards African American to be diminished. But that is definitely not the case. Culturally, African Americans have proven to be different than the non-Hispanic white Americans or the Anglo-American, right? And so that is something that we have to take into consideration. And the Muela cautions against using of Ebonics as the way or African American slang as a way to connect with African Americans, because that can backfire. It's actually a very stereotypical way of approaching communicating with African Americans. So just as we have to put effort into understanding the culture of Hispanics or Asian Americans or any other immigrant group, we have to also put effort into understanding the African American consumer, because they are also different culturally as well. In terms of nonverbal communication, you will see in your reading of Mueller that there are drastic differences. So in terms of time, space, eye contact, colors, signs, and symbols, you will see one of the things that Mueller talks about is the difference between monochronic and polychronic culture. And so you have very schedule-oriented monochronic culture, which is American mainstream culture, whereas African Americans and also other Hispanics and other groups, they have they observe polychronic culture, and so they do multiple things at the same time. You might find that they also may have issues with being on time. Also, Mueller talks about, for example, that relational aspect of the polychronic culture where time is spent establishing relationships, talking about your family, how are you doing, how is work, stuff like that, as opposed to getting down to business. Because one of the concepts that is not discussed in the book, we talk about polymorphic opinion leadership, where in cultures that have polychronic cultures, you tend to have polymorphic leadership, where somebody who is an expert in one area, because of the relationship that you may have with that that may be developed with that person may be asked for advice in another area that is not within their area of expertise. So, for example, meeting a car deal, a salesperson at your car dealership, and you have developed a good relationship with them, and you bought a car from that person, and because you are new to an area, you might ask that person about good schools in the area, or where to find a good doctor, stuff like that. And so that's when you then the whole aspect of polymorphic leadership comes in, where somebody who is an expert in one area maybe ask for advice in another area, just based on the relationship that has been built in that interaction that you have with them. In terms of expressing culture, one of the things that we want to understand is that when we see rituals and heroes and these various practices, these are just the tip of the iceberg. The values are what are at the core of culture, and that is really that enduring belief of right and wrong, acceptable or unacceptable conduct that drives members of particular culture. And so to other members, to non-members of a culture, you see practices, but then the reason or the values that are at the core of some of these practices, or the respect that persons have for certain heroes in their culture, are basically tied to values and can be so different. Neleen talks about the importance of religion in certain cultures, and religion plays a very important role in what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. It might make certain references, certain types of advertising, basically unacceptable in certain cultures, certain types of food unacceptable in certain cultures. And so we want to pay very close attention to those things. In terms of cultural dimensions, individualism versus collectivism, which is the work of Geert Hofstede, is one of those very important dimensions that we can see the differences between Hispanics, who are very collectivist in culture, African Americans to some extent, Asian Americans to some extent. They are very family oriented, have strong family values, and those things stem from collectivist cultures, as opposed to individualistic cultures where persons tend to focus on individual achievement. In terms of a very real implication, you can see it in practice. For example, in Caribbean culture and Hispanic cultures, putting an elderly family member in a nursing home is almost unheard of. It is basically frowned upon, whereas that is a normal part of American life. Assisted living and elder care facilities are normal, whereas in some cultures that is unheard of. It is more normal for an elderly family member to be taken into the home of the eldest child and cared for until the time of their passing. And so what we learn is basically that all of these things have implications. And in the last part of the chapter, Neleen talks about how that affects why people buy, what they buy, when they buy, where they buy. So you're talking about, for example, who they shop with. So preference for shopping together as opposed to shopping alone can be traced back to culture. The different types of stores, the different types of foods that are purchased, frequency of purchase. And so what I want you guys to pay really close attention to as you go through the chapter is not just the theory and in terms of these cultural terms, but the actual implication. And what we want to take away from the chapter is how these different aspects of culture affect how people think, how they act, their values. And so it basically will influence the lens through which they view all marketing communication. And that is why taking culture into account is very important for different ethnic groups. In terms of your assignment for this week, you have a discussion board. You will have to discuss what is culture, how culture affects communication. You also have to discuss the difference between acculturation and assimilation, and talk about what that means for marketing. I hope that you guys have a good time reading this chapter. Sink your teeth into it. It is definitely very important. And I will talk to you guys next week. Take care.